Welcome to Lesson 5, Learn C Programming on the Raspberry Pi. Last day we started talking about functions in C. We did some work with them, but today we're going to continue and maybe even back up a little bit because understanding how functions work is really an important concept in the C programming language. Anyway, just before we get into that, I have here a list of some of the Linux commands that we used so far, so I just want to quickly review them with you. We used the cat command just to display the contents of a file on the screen. We also used the cd command, change directory, to move around from one directory to another. Of course, we used the gcc command, which is the GNU compiler collection. We used this C compiler to compile our code. Excuse me. We also used the genie command to bring up a small and lightweight integrated development environment. We used the LDD command to show which libraries our executable code is using. We use the ls command to list the contents of a directory. We use the mkdir command to make new directories. And we use the wc, or the word count command, to count how many lines in a file. So if you get a chance, then you might want to play with these commands on your Pi just to get an idea of how they work, and also to have more practice. Okay, so let's go back to what we were doing. I've already logged into my Raspberry Pi. Remember, Model A I'm using. And what I'll do is I'll start Genie and pick up where we left off. Okay, so this is the example I was playing with in lesson 4. It's probably a little bit too complicated at this point in the series of lessons, but what we'll do is we'll concentrate more today on just making up a few other functions of our own. Where the whole point of C is to have a program which does something that's useful for us, and the program is made up of functions. Functions call functions, functions return values to other functions, functions perform algorithms, they do things. As an example, I read somewhere that I believe the space shuttle, the computers on board the space shuttle are coded in the C language, and I believe they have about 100,000 functions that they use. So that's a lot of code, probably 1 million lines or so. Okay, so let's talk more about functions. Let's put together a simple example. Remember, I'm working here from the top of my head, so we'll see if we can come up with something that makes a little sense. So I'm going to do away with this example that we did last time, and I'll start with something a little bit easier. So I'll go and create a brand new one. Oops. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a loop here to call a function several times. So I'll use the while statement. Let me initialize I here to 0, and then I'll say while, let's say I is less than 10, and I'll call a function. I'll call it my hello. Oops. Let me save this first. I will save as, and I want to put this into lesson 5. Lessons I don't have. I'll go to create folder. Create lesson 5, and I'll call this, I'll just call it f1.c for functions1.c. I'll save it, and there I have it. So if you look at this program, it's pretty straightforward. It has a main function. I have an integer here, I. It's initialized to 0. And I say while I is less than 10, I call this my hello. Well, I have to, since I is the control variable, I also have to increment I to in order for this loop to stop. So I'll say I is equal to I plus 1. So it calls my hello, then I becomes 2, or 1 rather. Then it calls my hello and I becomes 2, then it calls my hello and I becomes 3. And it keeps on going like that, calling the my hello function over and over and over again until I becomes 10. Once I becomes 10, then I is no longer less than 10. 10 is not less than 10. Okay? So let's code this function, my hello. You notice this time the return value I'm not saying is an int, I'm saying it's void, because I'm not going to have a return statement in this function. All I'm going to do is I'm just going to print hello world, and that's it. So there's my hello function. So remember again, I'm using the printf function, which is part of the standard C library, and that's it. So I can save this guy. I can go to build. Let's see if it will actually compile. Oops. Once again, it compiled successfully, but it has a warning message saying that my hello was not declared before it was used. In other words, it's used on line 6. If you look at it, it's used on line 6, but it's only defined on line 12. So when the compiler compiles, it starts at line 1, goes to line 3, 4, 5, 6, and at this point the compiler doesn't know anything about my hello. So it gives this error message. So let's tell the compiler about my hello. We'll tell it at the beginning like this. So now the compiler will start on line 1, go to line 2, line 4, 5, 6, 7. When it gets to line 7, it will say, aha, my hello does not return anything because it has a void here, and it has no parameters because it's empty in here, in between the two parentheses. So now it should compile without complaining. So let's try that. I saved it. We'll try a build again. And this time you see there are no errors. It compiled successfully. And I can now run it. So I'll execute it. I should get a pop-up window here. And you can see I do have hello world printed 10 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, press return to continue. Okay, so this is really the power of functions. If you want to reuse a function, you can just call it whenever you like. If you want to modify it, you can go down here and you can modify it. Okay. If you wanted to, you could actually, instead of using a while loop, you could use a for loop. Let me change this to a for loop. I'll say for I equals 0, I is less than 10, I equals I plus 1. And you notice in the for loop, I don't have to, oops, I think I have a mistake here. In the for loop, I don't have to initialize I up here. So I can just take this part out. I just have to specify I have an I. And I don't have to increment I inside this where I had the while loop before. I don't need that because I'm incrementing here. See, there are 3 parts to the for loop: initialization, test, and increment or decrement. So this should work just as well as using the while loop. So let me save that. I'll build it again. And compilation finished successfully. And we will now try to execute it. And there we have it. Okay. Okay, so this is the idea of functions. In fact, you can have functions calling functions calling functions. It can have all kinds of crazy permutations and things. Remember, the more functions you have, the more complicated is going to be your entire program. Okay, well, let's add now a parameter into my hello. I'm going to add a parameter here, an integer called x, which means when I call my hello, I'm going to have to give it an integer. So I'll give it an integer I, and in my hello down here, I'll have to give it an integer here. I could call it y. And then I could say in my printf, I'll print the integer out. %d, and over here I will say y. So this is really interesting. Let me first compile it and then I'll run it, and we'll just see how it works. Save it, build it, compiled successfully, and now I will execute. And you see I have the value of y is printed out here, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. What's 10 hello worlds. But let's just examine here what's going on. Here is the declaration of my function. Here I'm telling the compiler this is my function. It's called my hello. That's the name of the function. I'm also telling the compiler that there is no return. There's no return value. So my function is not returning anything to the function that actually called it. And over here, I'm telling the compiler that my function is using one integer as a parameter. So this is basically the definition of the function. Okay, so now here's where we use it. Here's where we use it, or what we do in C is we say we're calling the function. So main is calling my hello. So it's calling it 10 times in this for loop. It's calling it 10 times. So the first time it calls it, the value of I here is 0. Well, this 0, this I here that's a 0, is copied to this integer y. This is during the execution now. If you think about what's happening, once again, we are calling this function into execution. So main is activating this function. So control of the program is turning from main to my hello. Now, before my hello starts to execute, this I is copied to this y. So y is 0 the very first time my hello is called into execution. Now, the second time when this for loop goes around and I becomes 1, then my hello will be called a second time, and in that case I will now be 1, and 1 will be copied to y. So my hello will be called 10 times, and there will be 10 copies take place. I will always be copied to y. So that's why we get up here. If you look at 0, 1, 2, 3, y becomes a 0, then y becomes a 1, then y becomes a 2, then y becomes a 3, all the way up to y becoming a 9. Okay? So this is really the mechanism that C uses to pass a parameter from the calling program, which is main. Main wants to pass I to my hello. And the way it does it is it copies the value of I to y. I could have called in the definition up here, I could have called x anything. In fact, I believe I could have just left the x right out, just to say that's just an int that I have as one parameter. Let's see if that compiles. I'll save it, and I will just build it again. And you see it compiles successfully. So I didn't even have to, in the definition, I didn't even have to give a name to the integer here, because that's just a definition. It just says, well, there's got to be an integer here. There's got to be one integer. Now, in the main program, okay, before, when I want to use this variable here, I have to declare it. Okay, and now I'm using it here, and it's going from 0 to 9. Now, in the actual code of my hello, I could have called it anything I want. I could have called it XYZ. Then, of course, I'd have to change it here like that. So if I compile it, let me get rid of this guy here. I'll build it again. And now I will execute it. And you can see I still have 0 to 9. I have 10 hello worlds. So let's just review this again. This first line, I am defining the my hello function. I'm giving it 3 values here. I'm saying this is the name of the function. I'm also telling the compiler that it's not returning any value. And I'm also telling the compiler that it's taking 1 integer parameter. Okay. So now the compiler knows all about my hello. Okay, well, it doesn't know all about it, but it knows enough that it can do a compilation. So down here we have an integer I. We're going to loop 10 times. And each time we call my hello, we are going to copy the value of I to XYZ. So the first time XYZ will be 0, and we print a 0 here. The second time I will be 1, and that will be copied to XYZ, and it will be printed here as 1. And then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this mechanism in C, we have a formal name for it. We say it's call by value. So I'll just put a little comment in here just so you can remember that. Call by value. That's the way C handles parameters. The value of I is copied to XYZ. Every time my hello is called into execution, XYZ will get a different value. Okay? It's called by value. It's really a hard concept to kind of grasp at these beginning stages, but it is important. You might want to look up on Wikipedia, for example, what they mean by call by value. Or just do some other Google searches for call by value to get a better understanding of what that means. Okay, let's add something in to this program to make it a little more interesting. I'll add in another function here. I'll call it my goodbye. And right now I won't give it any value, any parameters, but I will define up here making the same mistake. And let's now create okay. So in this example now I have main is activating my hello. It's actually activating it 10 times. My hello is activating printf 10 times, but it's also after each printf it's activating my goodbye. Now my hello is activating printf once, and it's activating my goodbye once. My goodbye is activating this printf once. But because they're inside this loop here, you're going to get 10 goodbye worlds. So let's save this guy. We'll build it, see if it compiles. Yeah, it was successful. Do you want to guess what it prints? Well, you could stop the video and figure it out, or you could just continue on and watch. And there you have it. 1 hello world. Actually, 0 hello world, goodbye world, 1 hello world, goodbye world, 2 hello world, goodbye world, and so on, all the way to 9 hello world and goodbye world. So now you can see how one function, the main, calls my hello or activates it. My hello calls printf. My hello also calls my goodbye, and my goodbye calls printf. So I end up with this crazy output. Okay, so let's get rid of this. Let's just before we end, I'll bring up the browser here, and I'll just do a quick search for call by value in Wikipedia. And call by value. So you can read about this in Wikipedia. You probably also see a lot of, without doing Wikipedia, you could probably also see a lot of other explanations. For example, what do you mean by call by value? And you can go and do some Googling on your own, do some searching, read about it. If you already have a book on C, then go to the index and look up call by value and check it out. Okay, that's all for lesson number 5, folks. So stay tuned for lesson number 6, coming to a YouTube